Who write the Bible? Part 2. Chapter 2. New Testament Canonicity. The Church's need to claim New Testament canonicity. Canonicity describes the standard that books had to meet to be recognized as Scripture. Many priests are very strict in ascribing the four Gospels to the disciples of Christ, considering that matter as a non-negotiable fact. This attitude is because they cannot say that they believe in a book that they do not know its origin, who wrote it or where it was written. For this reason, they are trying their best to create clues, however weak, and then merge them to formulate a tale that may delude many people. Church's evidence on New Testament canonicity. Regarding New Testament canonicity, the priests are sharply divided into two groups. The first one admits that New Testament scribes are unknown and the phrases, the Gospel according to Matthew's account, Mark's account, Luke's account, and John's account were added to the New Testament in the 2nd century without strong evidence of its validity. The second one is rigorous in ascribing the four Gospels to the disciples of Christ. It collects false and incorrect pieces of evidence but may arrange and coordinate them deceptively to be believed by the average reader. These pieces of evidence are as follows. 1. Internal evidence. Through the texts of the Gospel itself, the personality and the name of the Gospel scribe can be identified. For example, the Gospel of John, we can perceive that who wrote it was John the son of Zebedee, the disciple of Christ. Through the phrase that mentioned that who wrote this Gospel is, the disciple whom Christ loved, John 21 verse 20 Anamp, John 21. 24. Besides, the scribe of the Gospel of John knew the customs and history of the Jews and the geography of Palestine. 2. External evidence. 1. Testimonies of the early Church Fathers. A number of the early Church Fathers had witnessed the name of the Gospel scribe. 2. Quotations by the early Church Fathers. A number of the early Church Fathers quoted the Gospel texts. 3. Papyri manuscripts. The present Church has thousands of ancient papyri manuscripts and many ancient translations. Respond to such flimsy evidence. 1. Regarding the internal evidence. There is no reference within any Gospel to the name of its scribe nor any hint regarding his personality. The reader can read any Gospel of his choice and try to find out by himself whether there is such internal evidence on the name of the scribe or not. On the contrary, the internal evidence, as we will present in the next chapters, God willing, clearly indicates that the scribe is an unknown person who was not a disciple of Christ. As for the claim that the scribe of the Gospel of John has identified himself as the disciple whom Christ loved, we say that this is a false claim because the scribe of that Gospel was talking about the disciple whom Christ loved in the absent form. Meaning the scribe was talking about another person and not about himself. Besides, where is the name of John in that phrase, the disciple whom Christ loved? John 21 verse 20, Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. John 21 verse 24, this is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. As for the claim that the scribe of the Gospel of John knew the customs and history of the Jews and the geography of Palestine, we respond, and where is the name of John here? Didn't anyone else know that information except John, the son of Zebedee? This flimsy evidence resembles a drowning man trying to clutch at the straw. 2. Regarding the external evidence. 1. Testimonies of the early Church Fathers. Some priests list several names of the early Church Fathers and claim that these fathers had testified the name of each Gospel scribe. However, this list is a big deception because the testimonies of the early Church Fathers must first be subject to scrutiny and meet the following conditions. It must come from at least 2 of the Church Fathers. The courts of our time do not accept the testimony of one person and require at least 2 witnesses. B. Both witnesses must be eyewitnesses and trustworthy. These 2 witnesses must be disciples of one of the disciples of Christ. Accordingly, they must have lived in the same century as the disciples of Christ. Nevertheless, by checking the list of testimonies of those Church Fathers, we find that each one of them had lived in a different century than the others, and none of them had seen any of the others. Some of them had lived in the late 2nd century, others had lived in the 3rd century, and others had lived in the 4th century. Each one of those fathers had lived in a different country than the others. Eusebius of Caesarea mentioned in his book Church History. At that time the apostle and evangelist John, the one whom Jesus loved, was still living in Asia, and governing the churches of that region, having returned after the death of Domitian from his exile on the island. And that he was still alive at that time may be established by the testimony of 2 witnesses. They should be trustworthy who have maintained the orthodoxy of the church, and such indeed were Irenaeus and Clement of Alexandria. Chapter 23, Narrative concerning John the Apostle. Unfortunately, this testimony of Eusebius of Caesarea is wrong because Irenaeus was born in the year 140 CE, at least 50 years after the death of John the son of Zebedee. That is, he was not an eyewitness. As for Clement of Alexandria, he was born in the year 150 CE, at least 60 years after the death of John the son of Zebedee, that is, he was not an eyewitness. Both Irenaeus and Clement of Alexandria had no connection to anyone who was an eyewitness to John the son of Zebedee. In the coming chapters, God willing, we will elaborate on Clement of Alexandria and how he was not trustworthy. His name was erased from the record of the martyrs of the Roman Catholic Church in 1586 by order of Pope Clement VIII, because of corrupt teachings in his writings. C. Each testimony must be independent and not just a repeat of earlier testimony. These priests, who give us a list of the testimonies of the early church fathers, do not inform us that those fathers were, in fact, quoting one another. The testimony was only one from someone who already never saw any of Jesus' disciples, and the other testimonies were just a repeat of the first one. For example, the church states that St. Papias had written 5 books, and the proof of their existence and their attribution to Papias is the testimony of Irenaeus and Tertullian. However, the church does not tell us directly that Irenaeus lived in the 2nd century, while Tertullian lived in the 4th century. That is, Tertullian quoted Irenaeus. That is, the testimony is only one, and the other is just a repeat of the first one. Thus, there is no consideration here for the number of the names of early church fathers as long as their testimonies were just a repeat. Both witnesses must have received this gospel by their own hands from the disciples' hand. In order these 2 witnesses testify for one gospel that it was written by one of Jesus' disciples, they must have received this gospel by their own hands from him. Otherwise, how can a person's testimony be accepted without the existence of the subject of the testimony, i.e., this gospel itself? Meaning that this gospel must be present and in the hands of the church fathers, and then they can testify that it is written by one of the disciples of Christ. Accordingly, who received this original gospel in his hand from the disciples of Christ? To whom he presented it? Where, in which church, he testified that this gospel was written by one of Jesus' disciples and in front of whom, from the other early church fathers, he testified that? Where is this original gospel, and how did it disappear if it was really in the hands of early church fathers? Honesty and trustworthiness. They should be known for their honesty and trustworthiness among their communities and the early church fathers. 2. Quotations by the early church fathers. The phrase, quotations by the early church fathers, makes us imagine that they had the original gospel in their hands and then quote it. Nevertheless, these quotations are due to 2 factors. First, the church fathers were not quoting the gospel itself, but rather stories that were orally spread among the people about the incidents that took place with Christ and his words. And those stories were then written in hundreds of gospels. Proof of this is that when one of the church fathers wrote a quotation did not write next to it that it is a passage from the Bible according to one of the disciples. Second, when one of the church fathers quotes one particular gospel, this is not a confirmation of the name of the scribe of that gospel. There were church fathers who believed all that Irenaeus had claimed that he had a teacher named Polycarp and Polycarp was a disciple of John the son of Zebedee and Polycarp had testified that the Gospel of John was written by John the son of Zebedee. Thus they adopted the Gospel of John based on what Irenaeus has claimed, rather than they have verified by themselves the name of the author of the Gospel. 3. Papyri manuscripts. The Church claims that it has thousands of copies written on papyri and many manuscripts written on animal skins and many ancient translations as well, but in fact, this cannot be considered as evidence of the canonicity of the 4 Gospels for the following reasons. 1. The number of copies and translations does not matter here, because these thousands of copies are just repetitions of one another without referring to the first basis, the original copy itself. Like the false news that may be circulated by all international media. The number of the media does not matter here as long as they just copy from one another without validating the authenticity of the original news. 2. The claim that there are thousands of copies and translations does not mean that they contain the entire New Testament, but separate parts. There are thousands of papyri that are small scraps, or contain one or two of Paul's epistles, or contain a few verses of the book of Revelation or a few verses of a particular chapter of a specific gospel, and this is what we will address in the next chapter, God willing. 3. Those copies kept by the church and numbered in thousands were not written in 1 century, but from the 2nd century until the 15th century. If the church wants to use as evidence copies dating back to the 7th or 14th century, why not also use as evidence the billions of copies currently printed from the 4 Gospels around the world and in all languages of the world? How can the church infer the authenticity of the 4 Gospels with manuscripts written in later centuries? Based on this, we will not pay attention to any manuscript or translation written in any century other than the 2nd century, which is closer to the date of writing the original Gospels. 4th, back to the copies that were written in the 2nd century and concern only the 4 Gospels, without the epistles and the book of Revelation. The Institute for New Testament Textual Research, NTF, Instituts für Neutestamentliche Textforschung, NTF, has recorded only 10 manuscripts that they likely date back to the 2nd century. Accordingly, the number of copies that the church supposed to use as evidence is only 10, not thousands, as claimed. Nevertheless, after studying each papyrus separately, we find that many of those 10 papyri do not belong to the 2nd century, but rather to the 4th or 3rd century. And this is what we will address in the next chapter, God willing. 5. These 10 papyri, which date back to the 2nd century, are mostly tiny scraps that cannot be evidence of the authenticity of the 4 Gospels. In the next chapter, God willing, we will put pictures of those small scraps. 6. The church admits that all that it has from copies, manuscripts, and translations were not copied from the original. Gospels, but from copies of copies of copies, etc. 7. Regarding the original Gospels, the church admits that all of them were lost very early, and neither a copy of them nor any copy that was copied directly from them was survived since they all were written on papyrus, which is a kind of paper that may be destroyed quickly. However, such a claim is incorrect because all the pharaonic papyri, which were written several thousand years ago, are still in our hands and were not destroyed. As for the original 4 Gospels, since no one of the early church fathers who lived in the first half of the 2nd century has mentioned that he saw any of them by himself or they were in his possession at any time, they were already lost in less than half a century, or they were written in the middle of the 2nd century and not the 1st century. Besides, if we assume that the original copies of the 4 Gospels were lost because they were written on papyri, then how did not any of them survive? How did not survive even one page of any of them? How did all the pages and all the Gospels evaporate? Papyrus leaf, when damaged, does not mean that it has evaporated like gas, but rather the edges and margins of the page may have been eroded a little. Moreover, how did the church not preserve the original Gospels despite its great importance and was able to keep copies dating back to the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th century, even though they were also written on papyri? In fact, there was no such thing so-called the original Gospels, so the church did not bother to preserve any copy of it, and this is what we will address, God willing, in the coming chapters. 8. The church admits that all Greek papyri have lost much of their importance because they were written by unqualified scribes. St. Takla Haymanot Coptic Orthodox website reported, all of the oldest Greek manuscripts of the New Testament were written on papyri, and date back to the period from the middle of the 2nd century to the 4th century. But one papyrus with the number, P74, dates back to the 7th century. Although these papyri are incomplete parts, they together constitute a big portion of the New Testament. Although these papyri date back to an early time, they have lost a lot of their importance because they were written by unqualified scribes, who did not pay attention to the small details. Coptic books. Free Coptic books. 9. When Erasmus, Desiderius Erasmus, was commissioned in 1502 to issue the first edition of the Bible in the Greek language, Complutensian Polyglot Bible, he did not rely on early Greek manuscripts that may date back to the 2nd, 3rd or 4th century and were written in Alexandrian text type, due to his fear of its irregularity. And therefore Erasmus relied on late Greek manuscripts that were written in Byzantine text type. The 3rd edition of Erasmus is the edition upon which the King James edition depended. Because Erasmus could not find any full Greek copy, he used dozens of Greek manuscripts so that he could merge them and compile the New Testament in the Greek language. Theologian Bart Ehrman's response regarding the canonicity of the four Gospels. In one of the debates, Dr. Bart Ehrman on the reliability of the Bible said, "When I was a Bible-believing evangelical Christian attending Moody Bible Institute, before I began my serious scholarship on the New Testament, before I began to read it in Greek, and before I saw what serious scholars of the world had to say about it, I was absolutely convinced that the Gospels not only contained eyewitness tradition, but that they were written by two eyewitnesses, Matthew and John, and by two people who were close companions to people who are eyewitnesses, Mark and Luke. Intense research has a way of changing your mind about things, but I do not want you to think that this is a reason for you not to use your brain. Even if you are the most hardcore Bible-believing evangelical on the planet, you surely think that God gave you a brain. Use your brain. Craig and I will agree on this. God gave you a brain to think with, apply reason. That is why God made you a human being instead of a slug. Do not be afraid of using your intelligence to find out the truth. The truth may not be what you were taught, but if it is true, you should believe it, not run from it. As I studied more and more using my intelligence as an evangelical but also praying about it, I became convinced that the New Testament Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses or by people who knew eyewitnesses. The first point to make is the rather obvious one that the Gospels do not claim to be written by eyewitnesses. They are all anonymous. The titles in your Gospels, the Gospel according to Matthew, and so forth were added by later editors. They were not put there by the original authors. The second point, none of the Gospels claims to be written by the person whose name it bears. They do not claim to be written by eyewitnesses, and they do not claim to be written by people named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are later traditions that were added to the Gospels. These traditions do not start appearing for about 100 years. Some people think that there is an early church father named Papias who attests to the witness of Mark and Matthew, but in fact, there are very solid reasons for thinking that Papias, who lived around the year 120 to 140 CE, is not referring to our Mark or our Matthew. The first time anybody refers to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, by name, is Irenaeus in the year 180, 100 years after these books were written. My understanding of the Gospels that they have come down to us is that they were anonymous, and we do not know their names, and they were not built on eyewitness testimony. But the important point that I want to make is that even if the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses or even if they did contain eyewitness accounts, that would not guarantee that they were accurate. Think about our legal system today. Are eyewitnesses always accurate in what they report? If so, why do we have trials that call in testimony more than one eyewitness? If eyewitnesses were always 100% accurate in what they report, we would not need law courts. If we wanted to know what happened, we would simply ask somebody. Eyewitnesses do not always get all the information right, but even if they did, it would not matter because the Gospels of the New Testament do not claim to be written by eyewitnesses, and in fact, they were not written by eyewitnesses. The Gospels writers were living 40 to 50 to 60 years after Jesus. They wrote the Gospels in Greek. Jesus' language was Aramaic. These Gospel writers were living in a different country decades later. Where did they get their information from? They were not the followers of Jesus. They do not claim to be followers of Jesus, the disciples. They were written by later people decades later in a different language. Where did they get their information from? They heard stories about Jesus that had been in circulation year after year after year, decade after decade, down to the time that the Gospel writers living in a different country, speaking a different language, heard the stories. What happens to oral stories when they are transmitted orally? They change. The Gospel writers have discrepancies among themselves because the stories that were told and retold were changed over time, and the Gospel writers themselves sometimes change the stories. That is why there are discrepancies. That is why scholars might be able to tell you generally what Jesus was about. They can list 8 things that Jesus did, but they cannot tell you the details and agree. Why cannot scholars agree? Because there are so many discrepancies that the Gospels are not reliable.